For our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Dr. Marilu Gorno-Tempini. Marilu Gorno-Tempini, MD, PhD, is a behavioral neurologist and the Charles Schwab Distinguished Professor in Dyslexia and Neurodevelopment at the University of California, San Francisco. She directs the Language Neurobiology Lab at the UCSF Dyslexia Center and the Multitudes Universal Screening Project. Her clinical and research work focuses on speech and language disorders in children with neurodevelopmental differences and adults with neurodegenerative conditions. The aim of her program is to improve screening, diagnosis, and care for individuals living with language and behavioral challenges, as well as to enhance our understanding of cognitive and brain mechanisms underlying oral and written language abilities in diverse populations. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Marilu Gorno-Tempini.
But thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and we'll get started. Today we'll talk about brain development and neural networks and the approach that we take, as Jessica was saying, in trying to make new discoveries and also care and have an impact on our individuals that we care for and on society at large. So if you can maybe start my slides, please, or I'll start them, right? Yes, there you go. Okay. So this is just a slide to remind maybe us and also myself in these difficult times for our universities of what a gift I think it is for us all to have our public universities in which and medical centers as UCSF is to really bridge basic research with care and community partnership and have the amazing possibilities that we have now to reach more people through technology and working all together to change policies to be in a more just society for us all. And I'm really proud to be working at UCSF and with you all to try to do just that. And what is particular about UCSF that maybe some of you don't know is that UCSF is the only a biomedical sciences campus. So we really focus on health and well-being of individuals, and the research that we do is really focused towards that. With that, I wanted to start by saying that really all of our human behaviors have their basis on these, what we have discovered now in the last few decades, are neural networks in the brain. And that really intelligence, as we used to think about it, is not a unitary concept. We can think about the brain about like it's really made by different muscles that all interact together and create what we all, most of us, have as asymmetric intelligence. And it's not just cognitive functions, as we some of us have been taught in our old days in school. It's all aspects of behavioral and cognitive and academic skills, including language, emotions, creativity, music, math, and all different aspects. And this is something that I want to always point out at the beginning, because we're looking at reading challenges and written language challenges, and we can always expect that there'll be other strengths that we want to take the opportunity to leverage to sometimes remediate the weaknesses. So another important concept is that these networks are somehow aspects of it are determined by genetics, but the brain is really response to data. So brain development, and this I want to focus on how important the work that all of you educators do is really shaping the brain networks, just like you think what we do when we go to the gym and exercise a muscle. So the brain of children is very plastic. One thing that we learned in development is that the specializations of these muscles in the brain really happens in response to the environment, in the response of what data, if we want to use modern thinking and in our AI world, what data we give to the brain determines the specialization. So the work that you do is really foundational and so important for brain health across the lifespan of an individual. So really small definitions. When I talk about networks, what we really talk about is hubs in the brain that usually are in what we call gray matters, which are where the cells of the neurons are. So this kind of gray mantle that you see in the picture on the upper left side, that's where the cells and the connections between the neurons happen. The white matter is really the tails of the neurons and is the connectivity. And it's how fast this connection happens, depend on this swath of myelin that I'm sure you've heard the name before, around the axons of the tails of the neurons. So the blob spots that you'll see a lot in my presentations in the brain, they can be activation. So how much basically energy the different areas in the brain, the neurons are using, or how big and how organized they are. So all these fancy imaging that we do looks at either function or structure. And structure is like taking a picture, a very high definition picture. So we can take picture of really the shape of the neurons and the gray matter or white matter mantle, or we can look at the activity and how brain networks, how those blobs that you see in the lower left work in synchrony with each other. So this is a lot of like what the pictures of what you will see, and I'll point out what they mean. A few definitions that we don't have to go through, but I wanted you to have them. As I've moved from the world of more basic science biology to the doctor's office as a clinician, to working with you all in schools, which has been so inspiring and important for my own knowledge and growth, I discovered that we use words in different ways. So I just really wanted to put there for you to have my definitions that we use. And I've noticed that sometimes when I talk to teachers or caregivers, we might mean slightly different things. So I wanted to make sure that you have them. So how do these different networks are organized in the brain? There is some specialization. There is also a lot of connectivity. These are, of course, just schematics, but in general, we can say that the left hemisphere is really specialized for language. How that happened, I think most of you will know that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So if an individual has, for instance, a stroke on the left side of the brain, if they're right-handed, they'll be more likely to have a language problem, maybe a reading problem, and difficulty using the right hand. So the current theory is that really language developed on the left side and in areas near the right hand, because in our ancestors started manipulating objects with the right hand and wanted to give it names, started wanting to give names to those objects manipulated with the right hand, which is controlled by the left hemisphere. And so in evolution, language likely developed in the left hemisphere because of that reason. And then in thousands of years, it started becoming more and more symbolic. And so the left hemisphere is specialized not only for language, but actually also for fine finger movements and manipulation of objects. And that's why often we see reading difficulties together with difficulties manipulating and five finger movements or pen grip. So what we sometimes is called dysgraphia or dyspraxia, and the two things might happen together because the left hemisphere of the brain is more specialized for that. The right hemisphere instead is more specialized for visual, spatial, and emotional functioning. Again, in right-handed, and these are the extremes. There's always variation. There are people who are ambidextrous, who have languages is more bilateral, and even as individual differences, we might be more bilaterally distributed, but this is in general. Why emotions are more on the, and social emotional functioning and visual spatial more on the right, they probably go together, and math, some aspects of math, it's because some aspects of math are very visual, and the early emotional responses were really in response to visual stimuli, right? The usual example is the lion coming to eat you, and you need to have an emotional right there, a fight or flight response to that visual stimulus that comes to you. Then I have time to translate it into symbols and make it abstract. And so probably the emotion survival system evolved near the visual spatial, and that's probably where these big categories of left and right specialization come from. So where does reading come from? Where does the symbolic aspect of language come from? And this is an interesting, sorry, I'm having trouble with these little arrows. It's an interesting concept because the brain takes thousands of years to evolve. How does it evolve? Its environment in the Middle East 5,000-6,000 years ago, how did it happen that written language happened? Was there a mutation in the gene? Was there a response? We don't really know, but the first written symbolic language, from drawing to using more symbolic representation, happened about 5,000 years ago, is a unique human skill. And sorry, I think this chat is not for me. And there wasn't enough time for the brain to evolve a completely different network for reading. So although, I like using the term the reading networks, really we need to think that they're language networks. They're language networks that have been reused for reading. So in thousands of years of evolution, we've created basically an organ for language in the brain in this area that is called the left perisylvian area. So this kind of big cut that you see in the brain below, if you look at the picture on the upper right side, below the red kind of, in this case, lesion site, you see that there is kind of what we call a schisser, and there the language network is really around that, those blue, red, and green dots that you say, that's the language network. And that's basically the same one in every language, in every culture, in every part of the world. This left perisylvian region does language. Is it exactly the same for each language? We will see. It's kind of like saying we all have a heart, but the heart of a marathon runner looks a little different from the heart of a distance runner. So yes, we all have the same language organ in the brain, but it gets specialized by environment in different way. So because this is a new function, written language, in the last few thousand years, it needs to be explicitly taught. It's not something that most people learn just by exposure, like language. It's oral language. It needs to be explicitly taught. And the easiness in which is acquired when properly taught is heritable. Just like, as we will see, dyslexia is highly heritable. And dyslexia or reading challenges, do they happen in every culture, in every language? Yes. But we will see that the writing system and the culture and the way that children are taught and exposed to written language can create differences and different symptoms of these difficulties in different languages. So for example, if we think about word reading in English, at least in my cognitive neurology world, English is defined as a deep or opaque orthography, in which only knowing the sound correspondence of printed symbols is not enough to be able to efficiently decode the language. So decoding is also a word that we use in different terms. I mean by decoding being able to produce the appropriate sound in response to print with whatever strategy. In some languages, the phonological strategies is the most important. In other languages, the morphology and the visual is also very important. But in every language, decoding needs to be taught in an explicit and systematic way with slight differences, thinking that each language organ in the brain in different cultures and languages might be shaped and connected in slightly different ways. So there are some irregular words or some homophones in English that are hard to decode just from a phonological point of view and might need some other strategies, especially considering different ages of children and what they're learning. In some other languages, like my own language of Italian or Spanish, the phonetic regularity of the world is of the language is higher. So we call them shallow or transparent orthographies. Almost, they're not completely always 100% shallow and transparent. But in these languages, phonetic regularity is higher, and thus we can take advantage in our way of teaching of the fact that these languages can use these strategy almost let's say 90% of the time accurately. Now, there are other languages that are even deeper or more opaque orthographies than English. And to an extreme, we can think about Chinese, which is a logographic script, which is highly based on visual perceptual. So there is no really alphabetic coding. Chinese children are required, and adults are required to learn thousands of symbols to learn how to read at a proficient level as adults. And so some of the strategies that they need to use to memorize the symbols are different. And we can take advantage of that when we think about bilingual children that are emerging bilingual of English in teaching them. That said, again, it needs to be an explicit and systematic instructions that might be tweaked in different ways using capitalizing on the strengths that children come to school with from their own native language. Of the various processes that we know we use for reading, some of them are more shared around across languages, like phonological awareness. We know is a very important pre-reading skill that is shared by most languages, but we need to take into consideration that the specific sounds that make languages are more typical of one culture or the other. For instance, in Chinese, tones are super important. They convene meaning, and they come really from the function of the larynx, and they're very different. In English, children are not taught to use tones to create meaning. And so the areas of the brain that perceive sounds get tuned at different ages, at a specific age, and which sound we use to construct, for instance, phonological awareness task in different languages can make the task more equitable across languages or not. So there's really important details on how we think about different language and bilingual language development. Another aspect is morphology. So morphology, the structure, the internal structure of the single words has more a meaning, conveys meaning in certain languages, like in Chinese and also in English, and more grammatical and structure, syntactic help in other languages like Italian and Spanish. So when we think about these different aspects of language in different type of languages, we can tweak our way of teaching or remediating reading challenges in a slightly different way, taking advantage again of the particular, we call it typology of the different languages. So when we talk about which areas of the brain are involved in these different processes, we need to think that science evolves. That's the beauty of it. That's why I love it. And we make new discoveries every day, and we need to keep our mind open and keep the channel of communication between researchers and practitioners very fluid and open, because things evolve. When I started medical school, I'm not going to tell you when, but a long time ago, we were taught two areas of the brain that did language, Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Okay, about 30 years ago, let's say it, maybe 35. And and now I just picked one new figure, and look how many areas it's divided in. We have higher resolution of imaging scans, we have better cognitive tests, we have better understanding of the meaning and of the science. And so we need to keep the channel open and keep learning from each other. What really made me back then fall in love with this discipline are these first pictures that I wanted to share with you of the first imaging studies of language. And what was really incredible to see, and I don't need to give you details of names of the regions or anything, but the different areas of the left hemisphere that are involved when people hear words or see words or just speak words or have to come up with words, right? And again, is within the same big networks in the left hemisphere, but different parts that we can, different, let's call them different muscles, and they can all help each other. And that's really what I would like to us to remember, is that there is always a way to get to that language meaning, and we can use different pathways for it, and sometimes we need to use them all together. I love this picture that I found from my colleague and mentor, Nina Dronkers. I didn't know there was a Frontiers in Neuroscience that is for kids. And so I put the link there for you. You might find some fun materials for the kids you teach, and to give us a kind of a very basic understanding of these different parts of the left hemisphere. So there is this area where you see the ear, which is the superior temporal cortex. It's very specialized for auditory processing. Really, that's connected to the brain, to the organs in the inner ear that translate waves into auditory signal. They get perceived by the brain there. And that's what, from there, we start building what we call phonology in linguistics and cognitive neuroscience and education sciences. What we call phonology starts from there, starts from the auditory, first auditory perceiving of the sounds. And there are specific features of the sounds that we can perceive. For instance, the distance between one sound and the next, the time and the shape of the waveform, the brain in that area can distinguish. And some of these specific features are very important to distinguish one sound from the other, or how to organize sounds into syllables. So that's really the building block of where phonology and a more abstract idea of phonology that is detached from those physical sound waves that the ear perceives. So that's what our brain really does. It takes sensory information and it transforms it in something more abstract, then can be manipulated in very different ways, like linking it to a visual symbol. So where does the visual symbol happen? It happens in more that dark blue disc that I added there. This is what is called the visual waveform area. The area where all those question marks are in between the auditory and the visual is where more the kind of idea vocabulary, the vocabulary of our brain is. This is where the kind of meanings of those words are stored. But the meaning of the words need to be linked to a more what we call a modal meaning. So when we think about a chair, we don't just think about the word chair. We think about what a chair is, where do we find it, what color it is, what we use it for. And that's more anterior in the temporal lobe, where I wrote the word semantics. So that temporal pole where all those little, Nina wrote it as little kind of comics. Those are where kind of more the abstract ideas of what a chair or what a person is. So that we call semantics, while the part that is more posterior with a question mark is we call lexical semantics. So the meaning of words and how they're linked to their visual and auditory concepts. So there you can start to think about the different types of reading difficulties. Does it come more from an abstract phonological representation, or does it come more from perceiving exact features of the sounds? It's kind of a continuum there. Then in that area in red where you see that round kind of arrow, the lower parietal areas, it's very important to keep those sounds in mind. So once we identified the sounds and we kind of matched it to a word and to an idea what that word means, to be able to speak it, we need to kind of keep it in mind, right? Kind of that process that we use when we want to learn a new phone number. We need to kind of rehearse it in our head. We call that phonological short-term memory. So we need to have that buffer, and then we have to hold it for a few milliseconds to then match it to the movement of the mouth and the tongue and the throat to kind of be able to articulate that word. So that's kind of what we call the phonology to speech loop. And it's super important, as we all know, that sometimes these phonological short-term memory issues are always part of the dyslexia kind of symptomatology. So finally, in the more anterior part of the left hemisphere, the frontal lobe is where we retrieve the words and actually we articulate them. So apraxia speech, difficulties with articulation of words usually come from this more anterior part of the brain. Am I going way too slow? I'm sorry. No? Okay. So here is a little schematic of these important areas. Do they sit alone? This is a language network. Of course, we need to pay attention, right, to be able to use all this network. And attention is a little bit specialized in attention for language or attention for visual emotional symptoms. So there is a specialized kind of system that is more for verbal attention and working memory, and that's a super important network that of course influences our ability to read and convert fluidly language into written and oral. And so really wanted to also point to that. Those kind of yellow blobs on the top are what I'm putting there for attention. So how do all these complicated networks develop? There is, and I'm sure you've all learned that, even more than me, different stages and ages of development. If we think about language, there is kind of an anatomical and neurophysiological kind of clock in which what we call the ventral areas of the brain, which just means the kind of like where the belly is in the lower part. So the green and dark blue parts develop earlier. And so there we said we have visual perception and meaning. And it kind of makes sense. Little, children, toddlers understand much more than what they can speak. And probably their frustrations when they're around 2 comes from that. They understand a lot, but they can't speak it. And the dorsal part, so kind of the back of the brain or the top, develops later. And that's where speech in executive functioning and what we said phonological short-term memory, working memory, attentions are. And we all know that those are areas of the brains that develop later. And so also in language, different aspects of it, grammar and syntax and fluency are more related to attention and executive functioning. So those are aspects that develop a little later, while the auditory and meaning part develop earlier. So that can make us think that certain strategies of teaching, like teaching phonological awareness or phonics, are more important to be taught earlier, because that's when the critical period of that system is, earlier in the ages, while some other aspects that are more strategy and fluency and executive functioning and even grammar are taught later. And of course, you all know that, that's where the curriculum comes from. But when we think about specific remediation for difficulties, we can remember to keep that in mind. In particular, the sensory cortexes, so the cortexes of the brain, like the one we talked about, visual and auditory, that only respond, that's why we call them auditory or visual cortices, because they are the ones who respond to the external stimulus that comes either through vision or through hearing. So that's why we call them auditory areas or visual areas. There are certain areas of the brain that are called association cortices that don't respond to an external stimulus. They're next stage of processing. So the stimulus arrives, gets processed in visual or auditory cortices, and then goes through this abstraction process that we talked about. And so their activity is at that point independent from what stimulus arrived from the outside. These cortices, the ones that respond, the first responders to the external stimulus, they have critical periods. So, for instance, we all know that when a child has strabismus, you need to patch one eye to make sure that the cortex of that area functions, that is linked to that eye's function and is not shut off. So there is something like that in auditory cortex too. That's why learning a language early, you don't have an accent. Because most people, if they learn a language early, they're exposed to those specific sounds of that language, and the auditory cortex responds to it and shapes itself on it. So if we give sounds later on to that child when they're 6 or 7, and we're trying to screen them for dyslexia, and we give them only sound that are not part of their language, they're going to have trouble. And that's where constructing tests and tasks in a very specific way is important, because if we use sounds that are out of that language in the critical period, we're going to disadvantage a child that learned phonology in a different language. And this is just an example, but other things that we think about. And of course, if we're doing only visual, a child who's been exposed to thousands of Chinese characters since they were 1 year old, they're going to have a higher probably visual processing because of that type of learning that they've been exposed to. And so we need to keep that in mind when we evaluate and test and help children that have been exposed to different languages, and is really a gift. Okay, I always love this slide. Why do we speak and talk and write and macaque and chimpanzees don't? What happened? And I'm sorry, these arrows went a little wild in our conversions, but that's okay. It gives an idea of the complication of the brain. So 2 things happen in evolutions that are really important that allow us to speak. The larynx went down. So if you look at that picture on the left, the larynx of the chimpanzee is very high, and that means they can't talk and breathe and eat at the same time. It's as basic as that. Half of our motor cortex in the left hemisphere is dedicated to regulating swallowing, speech, and breathing. It's very complicated, and we do it without thinking, right? We don't need to think, oh, now I need to swallow my saliva, and I have to do it when I pause speaking, otherwise my language is going to be hesitant. We do it automatically. Thousands of years of evolution have done this, have moved the larynx down, have allowed us to have the glottis and epiglottis, and the larynx and the tongue is an incredibly fine-tuned mechanism. And that's why articulation speech difficulties are so common in children. It's a very, very incredibly fine-tuned mechanism. And how it happened, we made all these different connections, and our brain grew and became more complicated. And so you can see in those kind of left arrows on the right how more complicated, gyrated the brain became, and we created these new connections that allow also written language. And a very important one that you see in the top right picture is the green, dark green tract, which is part of the arcuate fasciculus, and really linked those auditory phonological areas with the visual areas. And it's a very important tract for written language. So yes, we talked about this already, critical periods, the specialization. So the brain of neonates is it has this language organ that we talked about and is kind of evolutionary determined. But its specialization is then determined by, again, the data that we give it. So the brain of little children is less specialized as we expose them to different environment. And I'm in no way saying that we need to start explicit teaching right away, right? Environment can be the visual environment, the emotional environment, the linguistic environment. As we expose little children to good health, to good nutrition, and to a variety of environment, their brain specializes and becomes more and more efficient of responding to certain stimuli. A little bit, if you want to think about it, how we think of all the LLM and AI systems, right? They specialize and they learn from what data you give them. And I don't want to make a comparison, it's very different, but just for us as getting an idea of how important the information that we give children is. And again, I want to really kind of thank you for choosing your profession, because you're not just building literacy, you're really building brain health across the lifetime, because the way that these networks are developed is going to influence the way they're going to respond to challenges later in life that are health challenges, a stroke, a neurodegenerative disease, a fall, anything. The strength that you've created in these networks is going to allow them to then respond for a lifetime of brain health. We want to think about, when we think about these critical periods, we want to think about early and efficient evaluation. And we'll talk more about this later. Going back a little bit to brain development and bilingual brain development. So bilingualism is a gift. When I study and care for people with neurodegenerative diseases later on in life, people who are bilingual and happen to get Alzheimer's disease, they don't have symptoms for an extra 5 years. So the disease is delayed 5 years. So bilingualism is kind of giving the brain an exercise. You know, they need to switch between languages. You need to hear different sounds. It's really a gift, and we need to think about it as a gift. The majority of the population of the world is bilingual. The majority of neuroscience research is in monolingual speakers. We're trying to change that, because really bilingualism is more the norm than monolingualism. We just had a talk yesterday at UCSF from a fantastic woman neurologist from India. And what happens in India, which is incredible, is that most people speak 2 or 3 languages, but they might be illiterate. So it's a type of oral bilingualism that is not always, that doesn't have anything to do with literacy. So it's also very interesting. And it creates a huge challenges on how to evaluate adults with brain disorders, because we don't have norms in all those languages. And you can imagine languages that have never been written even. So it's really a great area of research that we all have to do together on how to take advantages of the multilingual and bilingual brains and create better tools to highlight their strengths. So again, we talked about slightly different codes, cultural codes for written language, and also differences in the motor speech and in the phonological structures of language. So again, we have a basic language organ in the brain, but it's shaped in slightly different ways depending on which mechanism one language uses more than the other. And we do see in our functional imaging studies, this is a slide that I borrowed from my great colleague, Julia Kovelman, and when she does functional imaging studies in bilingual children and adults, she sees mainly the same areas, but they're connected and functioning in slightly different ways. So I think what the science so far has shown is that again, reading is an acquired skill that in most people needs to be taught explicitly and systematically, in using all the different tools we have to arrive of decoding of the text in an efficient way. And those strategies might bear different weights in different languages, although overall they're all the same. Okay, so let's switch gear and talk a little bit specifically about dyslexia. It was a slightly odd behavioral neurologist, as we all are, at the end of the 1800s, that first described what was called at that point congenital world blindness. It was first described in cases that are had acquired language disorders, means that it wasn't developmental, it wasn't there from when they were children and their brain was developing, it was acquired in adulthood because of a brain insult. And so in this picture, I show you the most common lesion in the brain of people with stroke that had acquired dyslexia. And one of the most incredible experiences for me going from my early career seeing these type of individuals that had acquired dyslexia versus seeing young children that were struggling to learn how to read, that I think we need to keep in mind is, and it probably is obvious for you, but it wasn't for me, is that adults tell you, they tell you they knew how to read in a typical way, and then all of a sudden they can't read anymore. And so it's kind of easy, and it made them frustrated and angry and sad and upset, and made them use different strategies to go about their daily life that other people had trouble understanding, but they were able to say it. Now, children don't have that. They don't know. They just see that everybody around them learn to decode these weird symbols in the text, but they don't know that what they're supposed to do. They've never had the experience of doing it. And so the way that most time it might come out is frustration and not wanting to do it. And, throwing themselves on the floor and try to do something else. That's what my own daughter used to do. And I didn't used to understand it. It's like, what is going on? This is just as hyperactive as I am. What's going on? And same when she was put in front of a music sheet and trying to learn the piano that way. She had to learn it through listening, not from reading those weird dots on the page. So really keep in mind that most of the time, it's up to you to figure out that a child is having a hard time creating this mechanism and putting together auditory and visual information, because they're not going to tell you. So you need to watch out for the very early signs of it. So what happens in developmental dyslexia, and what is developmental dyslexia? So a specific learning disability. Do we like the word disability? We don't like the word disability. We want to call it difference. Unfortunately, legally, sometimes we have to call it disability to give these kids the rights that they're entitled to. I like to call it difference. So, but of neurobiological origin, and we'll see that we don't really know where it comes from. That's a lot of what my research is about, trying to figure out where it comes from in the brain. Why those connections are not, that we talked about, are not so fluid. We describe it as a difficulty with accurate and fluent word recognition and poor spelling and decoding abilities. The basis of the definition is this kind of unexpected. That's how the early neurologists described it, is unexpected, because the child is learning other things and it seems cognitively and emotionally able, and we need to have taught them, though, because most people don't learn to read. And so the two aspects to consider is within preserved cognitive abilities and in the presence of adequate instruction, unexpectedly, the child has a hard time learning how to read. Most often is caused by phonological difficulties. We'll see that there are heterogeneities, and you can see speech, phonological errors in speech and reading and spelling, sometimes slow word retrieval. So in tasks that we'll see of rapid naming, children might be slower associating this auditory phonological form with the visual form, right? And it doesn't need to be symbols, it can be pictures. So that's how we can look at it before we start teaching kids how to read, because it's this association between sounds and symbols that somehow is more difficult. And so we can see it in other ways. Difficulty with phonological short-term memory. Within that larger networks that we saw, the difficulty can be a little more up or a little more down. And so it might show as a little bit more visual, a little bit more auditory, or a little bit more in short-term memory. We might give a different name if it is like that, but it's within part of this continuum. This difficulty rehearsing sounds and words in one's immediate memory, what we call the phonological short-term difficulties, it makes it difficult for children to learn only by speaking, because only by listening to words, to auditory information, because they kind of lose the trace. Like if I ask you to learn a phone number that is too long, it's kind of going to disappear. Some of the numbers disappear. And this happens to these children when they're just talked to, like I've been doing for half an hour, just talk to. They just they lose some of the words here and there, and then it's hard to retain the information. Now, why do we use dyslexia or not use dyslexia? This is what is being very frustrating for me, coming from the medical world. I don't know why the medical world doesn't like to use this term. So these children fall through the cracks. It's not a medical code. Indeed, DSM is called specific learning disorder with reading impairment. Okay, whatever. I tell you, in medicine, nomenclature is a mess. As science evolves, people like to attach their name to something, and then they don't like to give it up. And so even in the medical world, we have different names for the same things. Whatever, let them call it whatever they want to call it, as long as we all know what we're talking about. So a lot of different numbers for the prevalence of dyslexia and how it's defined. I'm not going to go into the detail of that. I would say that 5 to 10% is probably the right estimate. It depends on actually how specific we want to be in the definition. If we expect kids to be below the 1.5 standard deviation on a phonological task, to have the criteria of dyslexia, then we might leave out a lot of the kids who have slightly different presentations. They're more executive, they're more working memory. So in all cognitive diagnosis, even that we do in adults, even in fatal diseases like Alzheimer's disease, we always have a range, and it's always a clinical decision at the end. So I would encourage you to use your expert also decision on what to do, and not rely always on specific standard deviation of tasks that might be designed and normed in ways that were not really equitable or were based on scientific concepts that were 20 years old. So think of it as an evolving field in which there is really this discrepancy in the expected way in which a child could learn how to read. And of course, we have to be careful, right? Because expectations are biased. And so this is, again, where trying to construct some equitable tools can be important from all of us. Keep in mind that, there are a few, and I put there the normal distribution, and there are a few kids that will learn to read no matter what. They're very few, like a 5% maybe they will learn to read, even if they're not explicitly taught. But the majority of children need to be taught. And then there will be this 5-10% of children that need extra doses. They need this explicit and systematic instruction, like everybody in your tier 1 instruction, and then they might need some extra help. And because of the plasticity and these critical periods that we talked about, the earlier we give those interventions, the better. What are the brain changes in children with dyslexia? We still working on it. Different in different individuals. Frustrated. I've been very frustrated. That's why I started the Dyslexia Center at UCSF, that there hasn't been enough medical neuroscience research on this. We say it's a neurobiological origins, but we don't really know exactly what it is, but there are functional and structural changes that are quite variables within that larger networks that we talked about. So although phonological basis of dyslexia is the most common, it can come in different flavor, in which executive functioning is very important, working memory is very important, and visual and visual attention is also very important. There is a strong genetic component. So family history is an important aspect to keep in mind. Again, keep in mind that people come from different environments. And so even in families, you might have different abilities in reading that have nothing to do with a genetic predisposition to dyslexia, but it's something to think about. And what are these genes? Various genes, again, a lot of different research still happening, different genes involved, what they seem most involved in, and maybe we can talk about it in detail another time, is the migration of neurons. Neurons in the gray matter are organized in a very beautiful, fine layer organization, and sometimes these neurons don't quite make it into that organization. I always like to give the example of having a little mole on the skin, right? The mole on the skin is melanocytes that, instead of staying in the deep layer of the skin, they've come up to high, and so we see them, and that's a dark mole in our skin. And sometimes we see these little dots in the brain. We're starting to be able to see them with the high resolution fMRI, and maybe in some individuals, these little dots in these critical areas can cause difficult differences in the organization of the network that makes learning how to read or speak or pay attention in a different way. So what is interesting is that what we see is that different type of neurodiversity, we can call it, might be different in the family. So a cousin might have ADHD, and the brother might have dyslexia, and the other one might have apraxia of speech. So the genetic predisposition is probably for this different type of brain organization, and not from a specific difficulty in literacy. Although it might be that the language muscles in the brain are genetically predisposed because they need such a fine-tuned organization of retaking these areas that are really visual and auditory and make them into language and reading areas. So these are all things that we're studying in details.
Dr. Tempini, we have just under, let's see, about 8 minutes left. Just want to give you a heads up.
Great. I think I said a lot of the things that I have slides for later. So I think we are okay. So think about reading is complicated, important concepts, a lot of aspects, biological factors, environmental factors, instructions, developmental periods is one of the hardest tasks that is more new for the brain. And all of these aspects can influence, maybe not the 5% of people that have quite severe dyslexia, but it can definitely influence the manifestation and how it shows up in your classroom. Things to consider. Sometimes there is also a general speaking and language delay in the milestones. There is a very important time point, again, in these critical periods. Children that can't put two words together by age 2 are called late talkers, and they very often then have difficulty reading, even if their language recovers. I'll leave this up to you. Very important for early screening is to think about the building blocks of reading. Like we said, those tasks that we can use to see how easy the brain associates auditory information with visual information, and how the brain processes the auditory sounds. So matching sounds, rhyming, learning, even just the ABC song, the name of colors, math facts, those are all kind of arbitrary links between auditory and sound information and print information. And a difficulty with learning those can be an early sign that it might need some extra explicit instruction in learning to read. Always consider the strengths. Visual spatial, long-term memory is very important. is very different from short-term memory. So that short-term memory to hold the sounds in mind, to then articulate them, is only 2 or 3 seconds. That's short-term memory, seconds. Long-term memory, so remembering those concepts after 10 minutes, is a completely different mechanism. And we often see a strength in children with dyslexia on that. They catch the meaning very fast. And if it enters, then it stays there. So you can capitalize on that, on teaching them how to read. These different aspects of this network that we talked about can create difficulties of strengths in different after the processing, and you can have different flavors of difficulties. And I think we went through this, and I'm not gonna spend much time of it. One thing that I really want to emphasize, many children with dyslexia have high social emotional sensitivity and functions. And although that will be a strength in their lifetime, they might be more prone to depression and anxiety. So they really need to be protected early. You probably know much more than me of tier of instruction, so I'm not going to spend that much time on it. What we said is everybody needs the same high level, high quality structure instruction as tier 1 for their brain to be ready to learn how to read and write efficiently. And then other aspects can be strengthened, and extra doses can be given for children who are dyslexics in slightly different ways and depending on the language. Okay, I'm going to skip this. I left it there for instruction. So kind of historical curiosity. Samuel Orton was another of a odd behavioral neurologist and cognitive neurologist, very interested in this. Incredible women, clinicians and educators that have made such huge contribution to the field that I wanted to recognize. One thing that I wanted to focus is that in learning how to decode the script in English, morphology is very important, is even more important in Spanish and Chinese, but is really important also in language. And I really hope that it can be emphasized in many of the intervention programs that you are learning. And it's a very important strategy to use for children who have dyslexia, live with dyslexia, but might have not responded to phonological and phonics intervention. It really strengthens and uses their strength in morphology, in semantics and understanding to decode the script in a different way. Okay, just a couple of words on importance and early screening. A disclaimer: at the Dyslexia Center, we created Multitudes, a state-funded free universal screener. It's not the only one that is being approved by the state, but we're very proud that we're one of the ones that were approved by the state. It's free. It's a public service for our public schools. So I hope it gets used. It was really thought about for our multi-learner learners. We constructed and tested it and did 5 years of research in California school to try to do this very hard task in an equitable way, taking advantage of the gift of multilingualism. And it is very important to screen early. Is not to diagnose, is just to intervene and help early. And to avoid the bad consequences that children experience if they're not able to learn as their peers do. And of course, then there is all like, if we think about economics, people think about economics. I think about health, but, there's loss of productivity, but also really loss of potential for these children. Very proud that the state of California finally introduced a bill that mandates this screening that we all working towards in the fall. I think it didn't do it before to try, and rightly so, wait to have a tool that was at least trying to be as equitable as possible. So what are the early predictors? I put them there. How slightly different they are in multilinguals. we know a lot, but we still need to do more. So a screener, to be accurate, needs to include more than just one of these tasks. And I'm sorry, it will take a little longer, but not that much longer. We worked very hard to make it as short as possible, but it needs to include some oral language measures, in my opinion, for it to be equitable and to be able to evaluate aspects that are very important in languages that are not just English.
And Dr. Tempini, just one more heads up on time. We are at time.
Great. So I think I'm going to just leave you with these slides and just give a last shout for multilingualism in screening and in instructions. One language helps the other. If a person is a fast runner, it's going to help them to learn to walk. So there are different aspects of language. We can talk about it another time. There are other aspects that can talk about it in more details than me. But taking into advantage, for instance, the fact that the Spanish language is very phonologically transparent, and children that come to school speaking Spanish have that mechanism in their head already, and we can take of that into account and use other strategies to help them read in English, and especially if they are dyslexic. So think about transfer between different languages. We thought about it very hard in constructing multitudes, and we allow in some tasks children to translanguage, and we really took our time to do the research in California that allowed us to use this language transfer. And I thank all of our partners. It's really a multidisciplinary team and a huge effort from everybody involved. And thank you.
Well, thank you. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. If we had an hour and a half, we'd still be on the edge of our seats. It was really wonderful. And thank you to our attendees as well. Dr. Tempini, if you would forward to the next slide. Oh, that's okay, I can do it. So you can fill out this survey, please, if you would. We'll put the link in the chat and you can pull it up on the QR code as well. We are going to be taking another break and want to make sure everyone gets this QR code and link, which is in the chat. But we are going to head into our break. We'll be returning at 10:30 with Dr. Lillian Duran on assessing English learners in special education.